When preparing for the panel, I thought of Warren Buffett, who always says, you might have heard, if I don't understand it, I will not invest in it. He is not the only investor saying this. The Rothschild Family Foundation, who's actually the oldest banking family in the world, going for a couple of 100 years, says the same. If I don't understand it, I will not invest in it. And I think it holds true for citizens as well. And so often we simply don't understand what's going on in our country, and we're too scared to ask. So what this session is about is me asking stupid questions, and hopefully, I know, getting some riveting discussions and some wonderful options for some views and to raise everybody's understanding. And the purpose really is to have a credible conversation here today and to start asking and to start having conversations which are interesting for all of us and that are so important. Because at the end of the day, we need to invest here. So let's get going. The first thing I'd like Mzu to answer, Dr. Krobok, is there's been a clear increase in service delivery on the stat side of things. Do you want to share some of those with us?
Okay, thanks for the question. I'm sure it is a very surprising question given all the public service delivery protests and the very low public mood in the country. If you look at some of the research that was undertaken by the South African Institute for Race Relations and published, I think, last month or 2 months back, it demonstrates very clearly that between 1996 and 2011, there has been a market increase in public service delivery with respect to people who have homes. They've risen. The homes that have been built during that time have increased between 5.8 million to 11 million. And people who have had connections to tap water, I think from 58 to around 74–76%. People who've had access to electricity. So there have been improvements statistically in terms of absolute numbers. However, that is not the main drive. That's not what mainly that drove people to make an assertion for change in 1994. That was a given, that there will be service delivery. And if you consider the fact that we come off a very low base and the expectations have climbed quite high, there's a sense of relative deprivation in society, given the inconsistencies in that delivery of services, but also the high levels of inequality in society. You are going to see some of the restlessness that you've been witnessing in the past 5 years in particular.
Kamo, can you join the conversation in terms of why do we then still have these protests? Zul started off by saying it's surprising to say that the stats indicate a different picture, but we still have protests. So what, in your view, is the cause of these protests?
Quite interesting, certainly. My view certainly is that it has to do a lot with a progression that the country has experienced over the last 18 years or so. People have become more aware of their rights. People have become more aware of that which they can expect from government, they can expect from service providers, etc., and all of that. And I think the notion is that the more you receive, the more you want. But importantly as well, what underlies all of this is that we have a nation of inequalities, wherever you look. Certainly, the gap between the rich and the poor still exists. And even those who receive find themselves in situations where perhaps the quality of what they receive is still not to their satisfaction. So if you start to unpack the complexity of this thing, I think there are many levels at which you can start to point fingers at. But the fact is that more and more, this is about proof that the democracy that was ushered in 1994 is certainly growing, and that people have a voice, and they are, voicing their dissatisfaction, and certainly to a large extent expecting for services to be delivered to meet their requirements. So from that point of view, I certainly do think that this is not something that will disappear in the near future, but it's something that we need to get accustomed to the fact that it will become a mainstay of life in a democratic, progressive society. And these things are not, they are common around the world. In any global, progressive, economic, growing democracies, protests are part and parcel of normal life. And I think what we find in South Africa, I think this perhaps is a new phenomenon, is a new development that we are now starting to get accustomed to. But it's something that we will live with, and I think it's something that is reflective of what a normal consumer within a commercial environment would certainly raise unhappiness about, that which they believe is not in line with the value that they place on a particular transaction that they engage with.
Kama, I'm fascinated by what you say. I've never considered a service protest a good thing, but you're making me think differently about it. So one should maybe place less accent on the protest word, possibly even think of a new one over time, and regard it as a symptom or a part of a democracy, that you will be heard and you will claim that right. Musi, can I ask you to share your view on what is a service delivery protest actually about? Is it about service?
No, thank you. Thank you so much for the kind privilege of being here. And having worn both hats, both of being in business in the private sector and now in the public sector, to understand it from both lenses. So I was very fascinated with the presentation that took place prior to this panel, because I think there's few key words, noting what has already been said. I don't want to speak more about it, but to speak about the idea of humanness and that of trust. Because I think actually political parties and political institutions come from a history where both elements were always in place. Perhaps maybe the transactional dynamics of service were taking place historically in South Africa. So in other words, people weren't getting the services, whatever the issue was. But the humanness component was always there, and the trust was always there, because you form part of a political system that you believe that your leaders you appoint. And one of the questions I wanted to ask, even sitting here, is who is the Hello Peter for the people who are living outside in Ghana? Just as a practical question. But if you understand the dynamic of that question, which simply means to say historically people would enter a political system, raise their concerns there, appoint their leaders, there was social capital built within that context. And therefore, if you are communally mobilized towards a particular objective, I grew up in Soweto and understand quite strongly that in Soweto, you would never break into your neighbor's house, you'd never complain, because there was a collective cause that everyone gave themselves to. When you reverse that, what's starting to happen is that as the transactions and the product of service delivery is being put before people, people are starting to ask the question, who do I trust? Who can I gain my Hello Peter to? Who do I complain to? But what's starting to happen more than anything, if you do a case study such as Diepsloot, for argument's sake, which is not far from here, is that people are saying, but my leader has abandoned me. Or those who go into political circles end up, speaking at SAFRO conferences now, but end up in a space where they're distant from the people, they're earning more. Against the levels of poverty, people are starting to create a mistrust of their leaders. And so then the competition about service delivery doesn't always become about running water or the tap or whatever. It actually starts to become about, I want to gain access to that, and how do I create political instability to create the right faction so that I can drive towards the achievement of that service. So sometimes it's often we found in our research as we engage people that unstable political parties often give birth to service delivery protests, because even though people are experiencing some level of service that they didn't get before, I didn't have a tap, I didn't have running water, but now I have a tap and running water. But actually my leader has moved away from me and there's a distance in that. Therefore, I want to protest to prove the point that I can also gain access to that, and here's an opportunity that's presented to me.
I firmly believe that leadership has not kept pace with what's happening, both amongst consumers and citizens. I think leaders, for whatever reason, have created a gap. And there is that gap, and it's our role and very important responsibility of the people in this room to think about your own leadership and how you're going to bridge that gap. So that was very interesting that you demonstrated that or spoke about that, because a question I'm often asked also is, if there's so many service delivery protests, does that mean I'm going to change my voting pattern? Does that mean I'm unhappy with the party I belong to? And what would your take on that be, Musi?
I think I'll use another case study. If you went to a community like Zanzibar, who is often in the news nearly every other month for service delivery protests, one of the challenges is that we could hold a service delivery protest 2 days before the elections. Go to on polling day, the ruling party will still win the same amount of votes, because I think there's that sort of humanness, that trust has been built into the notion of saying it's better the devil I know than the devil I don't know. And so there's this idea that says the quicker I'm just service delivery protests act as a form of democracy, and therefore I'm communicating to my leadership that I'm unhappy about something. But there, once again, what becomes critical is that the turn of South African political landscape does not emerge out of how many service delivery protests that we have. I mean, if that was true, union membership would be on the decline. And quite frankly, we're seeing more and more strikes, regardless of that sort of thing. I think the point that is profoundly made is how we deal with inequality. Because the gap between those who have and have not has risen, as the research even proves. And so consumers or citizens are starting to ask questions that as that gap is increasing and my leadership is moving away from me, that mistrust is what drives voter pattern change, rather than how much protest that we have. And I think people are entitled to protest. I think people, as long as it's a peaceful process of what we do, people are entitled to protest. I mean, even the Discovery Leadership Summit experienced a similar level of protest. Nobody called that unhealthy. It was just an expression of an opinion. So long as that opinion is in place, that's perfectly normal. What our biggest challenge is, what is the leadership imprint on that issue and what happens? And it's true for both the public sector and the private sector, in the sense that within the private sector, when people take on your brand, as they will, and you fail to lead them in a particular direction, that's what often leads to people's lack of loyalty, and they move on from one brand to the next.
Correct. It's exactly what we saw in the stats also. How do you deal with that dissatisfaction? John, my next question is for you. There's such a lack of collaboration between business and governmental agencies, and as I was checking these notes last night, of course, I got an email from the NBI bragging about what's been done on a public-private partnership. But generally, I think it's safe to say that the public-private partnerships have not delivered to expectation. So, how can we co-own the challenges? We've seen from the research that business needs CSR. Business is spending money on CSR, but how can we engage with the public sector to co-own the challenges which there are?
Thank you very much. I think what happened, if you look at the public-private partnership, and we had an experience where one of our companies in the group, Dal Direct, started a pothole brigade. In the 18 months that we operated it, we basically filled about 60,000 potholes. And due to government red tape, as well as fight between various levels of government, JRA, Gauteng government, etc., eventually we had to stop it. Now, if you look at it, I mean, we know what the impact is of potholes on our cars, and obviously for us as an insurance company, we knew that it will have an impact in terms of obviously having less claims, and at the end of the day also address the needs of citizens. I think if you look at it, it's really about, for us, it was the frustrating process of going through, on the one hand, this lack of ownership at the various levels of government, whether it's at provincial or whether it's at local level. And then you get to a process where people are saying, wait a bit, we have to now go out, our procurement processes need to be put in place. And we started the project just out of a need, a sheer need identified by a community and a very entrepreneurial individual. So coming back to the private-public partnership, in our view, I think how we can get it back is, one is to get common purpose. I think it's clear that we need to have a common understanding of what needs to be done. And really for us, one of the more successful projects have been a project called Harambee. Now Harambee is a project that started off when we looked at our call centers, and we employ about 70% of our employees are in call centers. And we basically then joined partnership with 4 other companies and said we need to do something in terms of unemployed youth, because it's mostly the 20 to 26-year-olds that we employ. And those are individuals that we take into the company, and after about 2 months we realize they don't have the necessary skills, and we basically now have to put in additional resources to train them. So what we then did is we got together, we got funding, put funding together with these companies, which is Nando's, Hollard, Clientele Life, and we formed Harambee. And Harambee then successfully obtained 120 million rand from the Jobs Fund to train 10,000 youths over a period of 5 years. Now that is really making an impact. And why did it work? It worked because, one, there was a common purpose between private sector and government in terms of the Jobs Fund, in terms of job creation. Secondly, I think the important thing is also the processes and the structures. What we did is we got together, funded this initial company, Section 21 company, and then basically from there really developed the infrastructure, etc., to train these individuals. So I think the last thing is also that I want to come is perseverance. You have to be resilient. I mean, working with the various levels of government, and I must say that it took us about 10 months to get Harambee off the ground. Currently, we've trained about 500 youths, and by the end of this financial year, we'll train about 1,500 and ramp it up to 10,000 by end of 2014. I think it's that what is required. One is common purpose, make sure that we have the right processes, and then have perseverance, because it's not an easy task, especially engaging with government, but also in terms of business and their various objectives to be served.
John, thank you very much. I'd like to hear what Nzu says about that in terms of policies. From a structural perspective, how can some of those bottlenecks be removed, which require all that perseverance and in fact lose time, delivery time at the end of the day?
Thanks. Thanks. I think one of the things that we really lack in South Africa, and which you touched on, is the culture of collaboration between government and business. The notion that the private sector can take over functions that naturally belong to government is an illusion. It will not happen, because the public sector should set a minimum floor of values in society, i.e. service delivery, public service delivery values. Because if it doesn't do that, and the private sector sets it, you are unlikely to have those upgraded. So they will just be good enough. You will never have the best in society. Now, given our historic challenges and where we are in terms of poor levels of services, lack of capacities in government, there is a space for the private sector to work together with government in enhancing service delivery in a range of areas. The weakness, however, is the dysfunction in government. I talk to people in the mining sector. In Rustenburg, for an example, if you look at the mining charter, for an example, it says that one of the things that mining companies should do is to develop, mining areas development, building houses, etc. Now, some companies have started doing that, but they were not succeeding because, just like the example you used before, the government red tape at local government, because they have to work through the integrated development plans. Government is not coming to the party with regards to providing bulk services and developing the basic infrastructure so that mining companies can be able to to roll out housing. I mean, some companies are not coming to the party, but in instances where you have companies that are willing to work with government, there are those gaps. And for me, what it reveals is just a lack of culture of collaboration between the two. At a systemic, structural level, you hardly find CEOs of top companies in the country meeting with the president on a regular basis or meeting with the line ministries on a regular basis. The two sectors live in completely different worlds. So the spaces for impact are in small areas. And it's just one example I want to use. The last point I want to make, undertaking some research for a financial services company at the municipal level. I go to this municipality, have a chat with head of human settlement, and he says that, well, we bank with this bank, and they are having good business with us because on the back of our relationship with them, they also have, they also funding massive human settlement development. However, we are not getting the full, the optimal services from this relationship as we could, because one of the things that we struggle with is revenue collection. And if we are able to collect revenues well, the bank does well from the transactional relationship we have. But if the bank can assist us, can build capacities for us to be able to address the challenge of revenue collection, there is a win-win. So there is an enlightened self-interest on the part of the bank. So that's a small area where you can find a collaborative relationship between a financial institution or a private sector and government. I mean, there are many. We can talk about those later. Thanks.
Please.
Sorry, okay. I think there's equally so, and this is an important message, particularly for the private sector, is that when you think about graduates that leave school now, the latest stats talks about close to about 60 to 70% of them finding their first jobs in government before they will in the private sector. Now, from a consumer loyalty point of view, these variables, I think one of the things that have happened that have transitioned where is that there's a lot more information available. When I speak to enough people, there's more an accountability process. Even now, I can be engaged with voters on Twitter. They know exactly where I am all the time. Whereas historically, none of those things could take place. There was a distance, and so social media and technology is helping bridge that gap. And so there's a lot more integrity in the relationship between public officials and citizens. That, unfortunately, means that with the spread of information, if I know that, to use a practical example, Woolworths' policy on X, which I may not have been able to know 5 years ago, but now it's part of public discourse, does that mean I'll shop at Woolworths? Does it mean I might pull away from it? These become interesting relationships between public sector and private sector. Because I think, from a policy formulation point of view, often the private sector leaves politicians to be able to do that, and then set policies for them. Whereas there isn't always this collaborative framework. I think the National Development Plan, which has just been released now, sought to do that, to say, can we gather together so that we create a better public discourse? But it's not happening enough at various sectors. It almost feels as though let government do what government can do and let the private sector carry on.
If I may just comment on that, I think from my perspective, I've been involved with public-private partnerships for the last 15 years. And in my industry, particularly fleet outsourcing, it has been a successful collaboration between government and the private sector. And any of these projects that we're looking at would range in the region of about 3 to 4 billion rands over a period of 5 years. And we have had the opportunity of running the fleet of the city of Johannesburg. And from a collaborative point of view, in terms of my colleague over there talking about the pothole brigade, for instance, we were called upon to provide the technological solution that would help using our vehicles, plus minus 3,000 vehicles that traverse the roads of Johannesburg, in identifying where the potholes were. And by so doing, we are able to give real-time, precise location of where that pothole is, and therefore allowing the pothole brigade to be able to attend to them. So it's important that we acknowledge where it exists and where it works, and the fact that the framework is passed and it's in place. But perhaps where we may fail and where we tend to fail is in the implementation and in those specific engagements. But I would like to believe all of us have experienced the Gauteng road standards. And some of these roads have come about as a result of the very same public-private partnerships. The private sector has been called on to do that which it's good at and hopefully deliver value for money. Not talking to the mechanism of how government would then recover the money in terms of the e-tolling. But the fact is that the infrastructure is there and it works. And similarly, so let's look to the Gauteng. You know, it's another perfect example of a public-private partnership that delivers value, which value though, you know, then the citizens, ourselves as citizens and consumers, have the benefit thereof. And it is my view that the more of the successful public-private partnership examples that we have, we need to encourage it. We need to allow government the space to become more of a regulator and allow the private sector the opportunity to bring their skills and competence to the fore in helping to drive, obviously, the economic development of our country forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kamo. I love to hear the different angles of the same coin. Thank you very much. It's very useful. What both you and Musi referred to earlier is that in rolling out successful service delivery, in having successful service delivery, you often raise the inequality in a specific community, which then again creates an unintended consequence for the government of, do I really want, how motivated am I to continue with this? And is this something you can add to that debate in terms of actual inequality going up by service delivery?
I think inequality is a global phenomenon. I think it's a challenge for the rest of the world. I've just recently spent an executive development. I took pretty much an initiative in China over the last week or so, where I met with 50 other CEOs from around the world, and just really looking at the Chinese economy and trying to understand where China is going over the next 5 years, in particular to the new political Chinese leadership that's coming into play in the next few weeks and months. But what was of interest was to note some similarities, particularly if you look at the Chinese economy, in that it's very polarized, in that you have the absolute poor of the poorest, and you have the absolute rich and wealthy, and very minimal or little of a middle class. And that in itself obviously has got internal macroeconomic challenges for China from a point of view of internal consumption of what China produces as the factory of the world. And similarly so, China exports more than it imports. So they have their own challenges. But bring that back home to South Africa. We more or less have similar type of challenges, which our political and business leadership have to respond to. And I think it is a joint and common challenge that we have to respond to as well as business, to say, how do we contribute to the closing of the gap in between the poor and the rich? One of the ways in which obviously we could do that is, as Musa highlighted earlier, that there's more and more young graduates who are employed by government. And obviously, being a businessman, you know, you always look at the bottom line and what you have, the minimum you have to deliver to your shareholders. And hence, that will drive your behavior relative to employing or not employing. So we will not necessarily employ for the sake of employment. But perhaps it's all about creating sufficient opportunities that will generate the requirement for more and more labor. Because as you employ people, people have access to resources, people have disposable income, they are therefore able to educate themselves, they are therefore able to engage with the new technological trends that are on the offing, and therefore able to participate more economically and politically. And I think it's a joint responsibility that the private sector and governments have towards making sure that we could close that bridge between the poor and the rich.
Thank you. Merci.
I mean, one thing I'm certain of is that, you know, I'm often caught in two spaces about the discussion about inequality, because it's not to propose that the most equal societies are the most prosperous. It's not to propose, I mean, if you were to look at an equal society, you look at Bulgaria, and you look at Bulgaria's GDP output, it's quite below par. It's also to propose that a nation like Brazil, who suffers from the same fate as us, have actually shown an incredible amount of economic output. Our difficulty is, what is our relationship with profit? On all scores, in the public and the private sector. What is the relationship with profit? If we're going to drive for higher profit outputs, at what cost does it come at? Because, and it's the same, and that's part of the question. If you look at, I mean, you look at China's absence of the middle class perhaps as a negative. It is a concern. But at the same time, the Chinese took a view to say that perhaps our approach towards leveling inequality is a misnomer. So therefore, let's let the rich get richer and they'll drag the poor with them. There's a question about that that's out there. And economically, I think there's part of the question in that. My simple view is that what government must play in the space government can do best at, and not necessarily interfere in certain dynamics. Government isn't always the best equipped people to run a business, therefore should not. So one of the things that we have to do is, by leveling inequality, we have to make sure we're efficient at the delivery of service, which is the whole issue. You cannot ever have a chance of addressing inequality if you don't deliver textbooks on time, for argument's sake. That's part of the fundamentals of delivering the basic services, so that South Africans, you know, I haven't grown up in almost a dual society, one being in Soweto, one being in a different environment in the northern suburbs of Joburg. By virtue of birth, South Africans still today have different opportunity prospects. A child that's born in a different township faces the prospect, perhaps maybe of getting a decent education, etc., etc. And I think the point that was made about Limpopo and the minor provinces is exactly true, in that you can't have that as a society. Children must be born wherever they are and be given a fair and equal basic service that they can start with. We can't have a disparity in the quality of education of a child who's born in Centurion versus a child who's born somewhere else. You're never going to address that balance. But on a macroeconomic scale, I'm not convinced that the objective of leveling inequality is one that we'll ever achieve.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. We've actually run out of time, but I would like to just, if there's somebody wanting to add something else, Dr. Koba, I can see you raising. You're jittery to say something. If you'd like to say something, please, let's have that final comment. With your delinquent mind.
I was just going to caution on the consequences of inequality. There are moral and social consequences. The most unequal countries, and South Africa is the most unequal country in the world, it overtook Brazil on that front, tend to have high levels of violence and crime. It's not the most, it's not the poorest countries in the world that have high crime. The correlation between criminality and violence tends to be with high levels of inequality. Now, it's on at one level a value proposition, whether we want to be comfortable with inequalities. And at some point, given that we start off a low base, there are inevitably going to be inequalities. It is the acuteness of them that is worrying, because if you allow that gap to be acute, you are going to have resentment in society. Interestingly, if you look at Tunisia, the Arab Springs, and you look at the indicators across, social indicators, they have been improving in absolute terms, but the levels of inequality have been increasing, especially between the tiny elite and the rest of the society. And that breeds what is generally known as relative deprivation, where people feel that they are taken for granted, they are not, they are neglected by government, and the policies are geared towards to serve those who are already well-to-do. In part, the response is to seek to achieve socially inclusive growth, but you're not going to do that if you do not correctly identify the causes of inequality and deal with them as vigorously as you deal with the manifestations or the outcomes of inequality. Thanks.
Thank you very much. John, you've got a few seconds, unfortunately, then I need to close.
I think just to from my side, from business perspective, I think we need to recognize, one, we're living in a context, and I think as business we have to take into account that that context comes with various differences in our society, and we as a business, we believe that if we don't take cognizance of that context, we might not have customers in the future. So if we want to build this market in terms of getting people the insurance, taking up insurance, we need to make sure that those individuals have a stake in this economy. And I think all the initiatives that we've been driven is very much focused on that. I think as a society, whether we talk about inequality or whether we talk about whether people have access to basic service delivery, the reality is we have a country where about 7 million people don't have a job, don't have a house, and we as business have a responsibility, and as all the other sectors in society to make it work.
Thank you very much. You've been a fantastic panel. Thank you for giving me your time and your preparation. It's really been worth it for all of us. Can I have a wonderful round of applause for them, please?